There's a reason the regulation is not working, not a reason that reflects inadequacy on your part, not a reason that suggests the techniques you have tried are useless, or that you are somehow resistant to something that works for everyone else. A specific, documented, clinically grounded reason why nervous system regulation, as it is typically taught, typically practiced, typically offered in the contemporary wellness conversation, so frequently produces temporary relief without lasting change. The reason is this: most regulation practices address the symptom without addressing the source. They work with the dysregulated state without engaging the specific history that produced the dysregulation in the first place. And a nervous system whose dysregulation has a specific developmental origin, whose chronic activation is the faithful, intelligent, entirely predictable product of a specific relational history, cannot be permanently regulated by practices that do not include genuine engagement with that history. This is not an argument against regulation practices. Breathing techniques, grounding exercises, movement, cold exposure, meditation, these have genuine value. They produce genuine physiological shifts. They are worth doing, but they are worth doing with honest understanding of what they can and cannot accomplish. And what they cannot accomplish on their own, without the deeper work they are often offered as a substitute for, is the permanent update of a nervous system whose threat assessment has been calibrated by specific developmental experience to a level of activation that the present does not actually warrant. Gabor Maté was precise about this. He observed across decades of clinical work that the nervous system does not regulate permanently through technique alone. It regulates permanently through the specific combination of genuine physiological practice and genuine engagement with the relational and developmental history that produced the dysregulation. Both are necessary, neither is sufficient alone. Today I want to give you the honest account of what genuine nervous system regulation actually requires, not as discouragement from the practices you're already doing, as the missing context that makes those practices genuinely more effective rather than temporarily soothing. The nervous system was not born dysregulated. This is the foundational understanding that changes everything about how regulation is approached. The chronic activation, the hair trigger reactivity, the difficulty returning to baseline after stress, the specific quality of a system that seems to run permanently on high, none of this was the original condition. It was produced through specific experience, in specific relational context, at specific developmental moments, when the nervous system was most plastic, most responsive to environmental input, most fundamentally shaped by what the environment provided and what it failed to provide. The infant whose distress was consistently met with warm, attuned, regulated caregiving develops a nervous system that learns something specific. That activation resolves, that distress is followed by comfort, that the arc from dysregulation back to baseline is a reliable feature of the relational environment rather than an occasional exception. And this learning, embedded in the nervous system at the level of physiology rather than at the level of conscious understanding, becomes the foundation of genuine regulatory capacity, the internal working model of a system that knows from repeated direct experience that dysregulation is survivable and temporary. The nervous system that did not have consistent access to this quality of attuned core regulation in a developmental period learns something different. It learns that activation may or may not resolve, that distress may or may not be met, that the arc from dysregulation back to baseline is uncertain rather than reliable. And it adapts accordingly by maintaining a higher baseline level of activation, by developing a more sensitive threat detection system, by becoming, in a word that Gabor Maté used carefully and precisely, hypervigilant. That hypervigilance is not a character flaw. It is not anxiety disorder in the sense of something that arrived from nowhere. It is the entirely logical adaptation of a nervous system that learned from genuine experience that the environment required continuous monitoring in order to maintain adequate safety. And here's the specific mechanism that makes technique only regulation insufficient. The hypervigilant nervous system does not experience regulation practices as simply calming. It experiences them as the temporary interruption of a monitoring function that it has decided is essential. And so it returns to baseline activation, its own baseline, not the lower baseline of the well regulated system, as soon as the practice ends. Not because the practice failed, because the nervous system's fundamental assessment of what level of activation is required for adequate safety has not been updated. Updating that assessment is what genuine regulation actually requires. The update does not happen to technique, it happens to experience, specifically to the accumulated experience of genuine relational safety, the repeated, consistent, embodied experience of being in relationship with another regulated nervous system that meets the activation with genuine attunement rather than with anxiety, dismissal, or its own dysregulation. This is what Gabor Maté meant when he said that the nervous system heals in relationship, not as a spiritual metaphor, as a neurobiological description of the specific mechanism to which the nervous system's threat assessment is genuinely updated. The core regulation that was insufficient in the developmental period can be accessed gradually, imperfectly, over genuine time in adult relationships that provide what the original environment could not. Therapeutic relationships. Genuine friendships characterized by honest mutual presence. Partnerships in which genuine emotional attunement is consistently available. Any relational context in which the dysregulated nervous system is met repeatedly and reliably with the specific quality of genuine regulated presence that allows it to borrow another system's regulation while gradually developing its own. This is not dependency. It is the natural mechanism of nervous system development operating in adult life rather than in infancy. And it is irreplaceable by technique because it addresses what technique cannot address, the relational deficit at the source of the dysregulation. Now, I want to give you the 7 specific things that genuine nervous system regulation actually requires beyond and alongside the practices that are already valuable. The first is honest acknowledgement of the history. The nervous system that is chronically dysregulated almost always has a specific history that explains the dysregulation. And that history, in many cases, has not been honestly acknowledged, not because the person is in denial in any dramatic sense, but because the culture does not provide adequate language or adequate permission for the honest acknowledgement of the specific developmental inadequacies that produce adult dysregulation. The first step toward genuine regulation is the specific, honest, non-dramatized acknowledgement that the current nervous system state has a history, that the dysregulation did not arrive randomly, that it was produced by specific experiences in specific relational contexts that genuinely warranted the nervous system's adaptive response. This acknowledgement does not require blame or extended narrative or the reorganization of the personal history around victimhood. It requires only the honest recognition that the system is running the way it is running for genuine reasons that deserve to be understood rather than pathologized. The second is the development of genuine interoceptive awareness. Interoception, the capacity to accurately perceive the body's internal states, is one of the most consistently underdeveloped capacities in people with dysregulated nervous systems. Not because they are insufficiently sensitive, often because they are too sensitive and have learned to manage the overwhelming quality of internal sensation by developing a degree of disconnection from it. Genuine nervous system regulation requires the gradual, patient development of the capacity to accurately perceive internal states, not to immediately manage or resolve them, but to accurately perceive them. To notice the specific quality of activation in the chest before it becomes a panic attack. To notice the specific quality of shutdown in the body before it becomes dissociation. to develop the interior vocabulary for the nervous system's actual states that makes genuine response possible rather than only reactive management. The third is the identification of specific triggers and their developmental origins. The dysregulated nervous system is triggered by specific things, specific tones of voice, specific relational dynamics, specific environmental conditions that rhyme in ways the conscious mind may not immediately recognize with the original conditions that required the hypervigilant response. Genuine regulation requires the patient honest identification of these specific triggers, not to avoid them indefinitely, but to understand what they are activating and why. The trigger that is understood as the contemporary representative of an original relational experience can be approached differently than the trigger that simply produces activation without context. The understood trigger carries information. The ununderstood trigger simply overwhelms. The fourth is the development of genuine relational safety. As described earlier, this is the irreplaceable element that technique cannot substitute for. The identification and cultivation of at least one relational context in which the nervous system can experience genuine co-regulation, in which activation is met with attuned presence rather than with anxiety or dismissal, in which the slow, imperfect, genuinely nonlinear process of nervous system healing can occur within the relational container that nervous system healing actually requires. The fifth is patience with nonlinearity. Genuine nervous system regulation does not proceed in a straight line. There are periods of genuine progress, of lower baseline activation, of faster return to baseline after stress, of greater capacity for genuine presence in previously triggering situations. And there are periods of genuine regression, of the old patterns returning with their original force in response to sufficient stress or sufficient trigger density. These regressions are not failures of the healing process. They are the healing process being genuinely tested, and the response to them, whether it is met with shame and the conclusion that genuine change is impossible, or with honest acknowledgement and compassionate recommitment to the ongoing work, determines more about the eventual trajectory of regulation than the regression itself. The sixth is the integration of genuine physiological practice into daily life rather than as crisis response. The breathing practices, the grounding techniques, the movement, and the genuine rest, these have most value when they are practiced daily in ordinary states rather than deployed only when the activation is already peaked. The nervous system that is practiced in regulation during ordinary moments develops the regulatory capacity that is available during extraordinary ones. The nervous system that only encounters regulation practices at moments of crisis is being asked to apply a skill in its most demanding possible context before that skill has been genuinely developed. The seventh thing, and the one that Gabor Maté returned to as the most important and the most consistently overlooked in every conversation about nervous system regulation. The relationship with the dysregulation itself needs to change before the dysregulation will genuinely change. The nervous system that is met with shame about its own activation, that is treated as a malfunction to be corrected, an embarrassment to be hidden, a problem to be solved as efficiently as possible, that nervous system does not receive the signal that its environment has changed. It receives the signal that its environment still requires the same level of defensive activation that the original environment required. Because shame and self-judgment are themselves dysregulating. And the system that is chronically shamed for its dysregulation is a system that is being chronically dysregulated by its own response to its dysregulation. The relationship that allows genuine regulation to develop is the compassionate one, the one that meets the activation with honest acknowledgement and genuine curiosity rather than with shame and urgency, the one that treats the nervous system signals as information rather than as malfunction, the one that communicates through consistent compassionate response rather than through technique alone that the environment has genuinely changed, that the level of activation the original environment required is no longer required here, that it is finally, genuinely safe enough to begin to come down. That communication cannot be made through breathing exercises alone. It is made through the daily, consistent, genuinely compassionate quality of the relationship the self has with its own interior experience. And developing that relationship slowly, imperfectly, with genuine patience for the nonlinearity of the process is the thing that genuine nervous system regulation is actually built on. And the privilege of a lifetime, what the one Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are in a nervous system that finally, genuinely knows it is safe enough to let you.